The German voices crackled through the radio at exactly 10:47 p.m. Saturday night, and Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she translated their words. They were conducting final communications checks, confirming positions, and discussing the destruction of what they called the primary target at sunrise. But the detail that terrified Sarah most was a casual reference to eliminating the radio interference problem. They had detected her listening. Somehow they knew that someone was intercepting their communications, and they planned to deal with it before proceeding with their operation. Sarah's hands shook as she wrote down the final transmissions. The voices mentioned 3 teams positioned at different locations around town, and they specifically discussed neutralizing the antenna source near the courthouse area. Her family's house was only 4 blocks from the courthouse. She ran to her parents' bedroom and shook them awake. "Mama, Papa, we have to leave, right now." Miguel sat up immediately, recognizing the urgency in his daughter's voice. "What's happening, mija?" "They know about me." The German voices. "They figured out that someone is listening to their radio. Communications. They're planning to come here tonight." Sarah's words tumbled out in a rush as she helped her mother gather essential belongings. Elena moved quickly despite her confusion. Years of living near the border during wartime had taught her to trust her family's instincts about danger. Within minutes, they had packed a small bag and were heading toward their truck. As they drove through the dark streets, Sarah explained what she had heard. Miguel made a decision that surprised her. Instead of driving toward El Paso to find federal authorities, he headed toward the Peterson farm on the hill overlooking town. "If these people are planning something at sunrise, we need to see what they're doing," Miguel said grimly. "And from Peterson's hill, we can observe the whole valley." The drive to the farm took 20 minutes on winding dirt roads. Old Henrik Peterson had been Miguel's friend since childhood, and he welcomed the Martinez family despite the late hour. When Sarah explained her discovery, Peterson's weathered face grew serious. "I've noticed strange lights moving around town at night. This past week," he said slowly. "Thought it might be teenagers, but the lights were too organized, too purposeful. And yesterday I saw men with surveying equipment near the railroad bridge, but they scattered when they noticed me watching." Peterson's farm commanded a perfect view of the entire town and the surrounding desert. As they settled in with binoculars and Peterson's old hunting rifle, Sarah continued monitoring the German communications on a portable radio she had grabbed from her father's shop. Just after midnight, the enemy voices confirmed that the radio source has been eliminated. But Sarah was still receiving their transmissions clearly, which meant they had attacked the wrong location. They had probably destroyed Deputy Carson's radio equipment at the courthouse, mistaking it for the source of the interference. Around 2 a.m., Sarah spotted movement in the darkness below. 3 groups of figures were positioning themselves at strategic points around town, near the railroad bridge, at the water treatment plant, and close to the main highway junction. Through the binoculars, she could see they carried equipment that looked like explosives. "They're going to cut off the town," Sarah realized aloud. "If they destroy the bridge, the water plant, and block the highway, they can control access to this entire area." Peterson nodded grimly. "This is perfect territory for establishing a base of operations, close to the Mexican border, isolated, with good sight lines in all directions. If they control this area, they could monitor and disrupt military supply lines running between the bases in Texas and California." As dawn approached, Sarah intercepted increasingly urgent German transmissions. The operation was proceeding as planned, but something had gone wrong with one of the teams. They were reporting unexpected resistance near the water treatment plant. Through the binoculars, they could see muzzle flashes and movement in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone was fighting back against the saboteurs, but Sarah couldn't tell who it might be. "We have to help them," Miguel said, checking Peterson's rifle. "Papa." "No," Sarah protested. "You don't know how many of them there are, or how well armed they might be." But Peterson was already moving. "There's another way," the old farmer said. "The town's emergency siren is connected to a manual switch in my barn. During the last war, they set up a warning system for the whole valley. If I can get that siren going, it'll wake up everyone within 10 miles. As the 3 men prepared to act, Sarah made her own decision. She had been passive long enough, gathering intelligence while others faced the danger. It was time to use what she had learned to save her community. She studied her notebooks one more time, looking for any detail that might give them an advantage. In her careful translations, she found something crucial, a reference to Extraction Point Alpha, and a specific time when the saboteurs plan to withdraw. "They're not planning to stay and fight," Sarah announced. "They want to cause maximum damage and then disappear before anyone can organize a response. But I know where they're planning to meet for their escape." The battle for Sarah's hometown was about to begin, and a 19-year-old girl with a notebook full of enemy secrets had become the key to defending everything she loved. The antenna repair that had started this entire adventure was about to save far more than just their radio reception. The emergency siren's wail cut through the dawn air like a knife, echoing across the desert valley and jolting the entire town awake. From Peterson's Hill, Sarah watched as lights began flickering on in houses throughout the community. The German saboteurs had not expected their surprise attack to be met with an immediate town-wide alarm. Through her radio, Sarah heard the enemy voices switch to rapid, panicked German. They were angry and confused about the siren, and their carefully planned operation was already falling apart. She quickly translated for the others. "The alarm has compromised our positions. Team 3, abort your approach to the highway junction. Team 1, accelerate the bridge demolition." Miguel grabbed the radio from Sarah. "Can you contact anyone on this thing? Police? Military? Anyone?" Sarah frantically adjusted the dials, searching for emergency frequencies she remembered from her father's radio manuals. After several tense minutes, she made contact with a National Guard communications post in El Paso. The voice on the other end sounded skeptical until Sarah began providing specific details about the enemy positions and their planned targets. "Young lady, how do you know these details?" the military operator asked. "I've been monitoring their radio communications for 3 days," Sarah replied quickly. "They're using a frequency that my antenna picks up clearly. I can hear everything they're saying." Within minutes, Sarah found herself serving as a real-time translator and intelligence coordinator for a rapidly organized defense of her town. The National Guard operator patched her through to additional military units, and soon Sarah was providing simultaneous translation of German communications to multiple law enforcement and military agencies. Meanwhile, Peterson had armed himself and was preparing to leave the farm. "Those boys at the water plant are still fighting, but they're outnumbered," he announced after scanning the area with binoculars. "Miguel, can you handle a rifle?" Before Miguel could answer, Sarah's mother Elena surprised everyone by standing up with Peterson's shotgun. "I grew up hunting rabbits with my brothers in Mexico," she said calmly. "I know how to shoot." The family that had started this adventure by simply trying to fix their radio reception was now coordinating a defense operation while preparing for armed combat. Through her ongoing radio monitoring, Sarah learned that the saboteurs had expected to complete their mission unopposed. The immediate alarm and organized response had caught them completely off guard. Their leader was demanding an explanation for how their operation had been detected. "Team 2, report status," the German voice commanded. "Sir, unknown forces are engaging us at the water facility. They knew we were coming. This appears to be a planned counter-operation." Sarah translated rapidly for her military contacts, who were now coordinating the arrival of federal agents and additional National Guard units. But the closest help was still hours away, and the battle for the town was happening right now as the sun rose higher. Sarah could see the full scope of the enemy operation. The saboteurs had positioned explosives at 3 critical points that would effectively isolate the town and create a base of operations near the Mexican border. Their plan was sophisticated and well-researched, suggesting months of preparation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated a teenage girl's ability to understand their language and intercept their communications. The firefight at the water treatment plant intensified as more townspeople arrived to help. Sarah realized that Deputy Carson and several local veterans had organized a defensive response, much more quickly than the saboteurs had anticipated. The emergency siren had not only alerted the community, but had also activated informal defense networks established during the early years of the war. Through her radio, Sarah heard the German commander ordering a retreat to Extraction Point, Alpha, the location she had identified from her translations. She quickly relayed this information to her military contacts, who began coordinating an interception. "Sarah, this is Colonel Martinez at Fort Bliss," came a voice over the radio. "We have units moving toward the extraction point you identified. Can you continue monitoring their communications and provide updates on their movement?" Sarah felt a surge of pride hearing her own last name from a military officer who was now depending on her intelligence. "Yes, sir. I'll stay on this frequency and translate everything I hear." As the morning progressed, the saboteurs' carefully planned operation continued to unravel. Their surprise attack had become a running battle with an increasingly organized defense. Local hunters, veterans, and even teenagers armed with hunting rifles had joined the fight to protect their community. But the most crucial element in the defense was Sarah herself, sitting on a hill with her notebooks and radio, serving as the eyes and ears that allowed the defenders to anticipate every enemy move. The German voices grew more desperate as their situation deteriorated. Sarah learned that they had planned multiple backup escape routes, but each one was being compromised as she translated their communications in real time to the arriving federal agents. By mid-morning, what had begun as a surprise sabotage operation had become a coordinated manhunt, with Sarah Martinez serving as the primary intelligence source for multiple law enforcement agencies. The girl who had simply wanted to fix static on her family radio had become the most important person in a counterintelligence operation that would determine the fate of her entire region. Sarah Martinez had always been good with her hands. Growing up in a small border town in Texas during the 1940s, she learned early that if something broke, you fixed it yourself. Her father owned the only radio repair shop in town, and by the time she was 12, Sarah could replace vacuum tubes and solder connections better than most grown men. The old antenna on their roof had been acting up for weeks. Every evening, when her father tried to tune into the news broadcasts, static would crackle through their living room radio like angry bees. The townspeople depended on their radio for news from the war overseas, and lately, the reception had become so poor that neighbors started gathering at other houses to listen to President Roosevelt's fireside chats. On a particularly hot Thursday afternoon in July 1943, Sarah decided she had heard enough complaints. She grabbed her father's toolbox, threw on her work overalls, and climbed the rickety wooden ladder to their roof. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as she examined the antenna array. The main copper wire had corroded where it connected to. The lead-in cable and several of the insulators had cracked from years of harsh weather. As Sarah worked, sweat dripping from her forehead, she noticed something odd. Their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, was hanging laundry on the line, but she kept glancing nervously toward the hills beyond town. 3 black cars with government license plates had been parked near the courthouse since morning, and men in dark suits had been asking questions around town. The war had everyone on edge, especially this close to the Mexican border. Sarah carefully stripped the corroded wire and twisted on a new connection. She had learned to be methodical from her father, who always said that rushed electrical work was dangerous work. As she tightened the connection with her pliers, she heard a faint crackling from the radio downstairs. Her mother was trying to tune in the afternoon program, but instead of music, Sarah could hear what sounded like voices speaking in a foreign language. The voices were too faint to understand clearly, but something about their rhythm and tone made Sarah pause. She adjusted the antenna slightly, trying to improve the signal for her mother. But the foreign voices grew stronger instead. Curious now, Sarah climbed down from the roof and went inside to investigate. Her mother, Elena, was standing by the large wooden radio in their living room, turning the dial slowly. "Something's wrong with this machine," she muttered in her accented English. "I keep getting these strange voices instead of the music program." Sarah knelt beside the radio and listened carefully. The voices were speaking German, she realized with a chill. She had heard enough German broadcasts monitored by the government to recognize the language. But these weren't the usual propaganda, broadcasts from Berlin that sometimes bled through on shortwave frequencies. These voices sounded closer, more immediate. "Mama, turn the volume down," Sarah whispered urgently. Something in her tone made her mother comply immediately. Sarah fine-tuned the dial, trying to lock onto the signal. The voices became clearer, and her blood ran cold as she began to make out individual words. Her high school German teacher, Mrs. Fisher, had been born in Germany before the First War. Despite the suspicion this brought her during wartime, she had continued teaching, insisting that understanding the enemy's language was patriotic. Sarah had been one of her best students, and now those lessons came flooding back. The voices were discussing coordinates, locations, and timing. They mentioned the border, supply routes, and something about a meeting scheduled for the weekend. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued listening. These weren't random radio broadcasts from overseas. These were communications between people who were somewhere nearby, planning something that sounded very much like an operation on American soil. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah sat glued to the radio, carefully writing down everything she could understand in a school notebook. Her mother brought her cold lemonade and asked questions, but Sarah was too focused to explain properly. She knew she was listening to something important, something dangerous. When her father returned from the shop that evening, Sarah was still at the radio, pages of notes scattered around her. The antenna repair that was supposed to take an hour had accidentally turned their ordinary family radio into a listening post for enemy communications, and Sarah Martinez, a 19-year-old girl who just wanted to fix the static, had stumbled onto what sounded like a plan that could threaten her entire community. The voices continued into the night, and Sarah continued listening, not yet fully understanding that her simple antenna repair had put her at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. By noon, Sarah had been translating enemy communications non-stop for over 12 hours, and her voice was becoming hoarse. But the information flowing through her radio was too important to stop. The German saboteurs were trapped in an increasingly tight circle as federal agents, National Guard units, and local defenders closed in from all directions. Team 1, what is your status? The enemy commander demanded over the radio. Sir, we are surrounded at the bridge position. Request immediate extraction, came the desperate reply. Sarah translated quickly for Colonel Martinez, who was now coordinating the operation from a temporary command post that had been established at the courthouse. They're asking for emergency evacuation from the railroad bridge. The commander is considering whether to abandon Team 1. Can you tell us how many people we're dealing with total? The colonel asked. Sarah flipped through her notebooks, reviewing 3 days of intercepted communications. Based on the radio chatter, I estimate 12 to 15 operatives total, divided into 4 teams. 3 teams were assigned to targets in town, and 1 team was positioned at the extraction point. The intelligence Sarah had gathered was proving invaluable. Her systematic documentation of enemy communications had created a complete picture of the sabotage operation, something that would have taken professional intelligence analysts weeks to assemble. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah overheard something that chilled her blood. The German commander was ordering the activation of what he called the final contingency. In her translations, she had seen references to this contingency, but had not understood what it meant. Colonel, they're implementing something called final contingency, Sarah reported urgently. I think it means they're going to try to complete their mission even if they don't escape. Within minutes, her fears were confirmed. The enemy commander was ordering his remaining teams to detonate their explosives simultaneously, regardless of whether they could escape afterward. They were choosing to complete their sabotage mission, even if it meant sacrificing themselves. All teams prepare for synchronized detonation in 30 minutes, the German voice commanded. Operation Desert Fox will be completed as planned. Sarah's translation sent shockwaves through the command post. 30 minutes was not enough time for bomb disposal experts to reach all the target locations, and there were still enemy operatives fighting at each site. Sarah, do they mention anything about how the explosives are triggered? Colonel Martinez asked urgently. Sarah frantically reviewed her notes and listened to the ongoing radio traffic. They keep referring to radio detonation and frequency coordination. I think they're going to set off all the bombs using radio signals. Elena Martinez, who had been quietly listening to her daughter's translations all day, suddenly spoke up. Mija, if they're using radio signals to set off bombs, what happens if someone interferes with their radio frequency? Sarah's eyes widened. as she understood her mother's insight. "Papa, do you have your jamming equipment at the shop?" Miguel nodded. During the early years of the war, he had experimented with radio jamming equipment to help defend against enemy propaganda broadcasts. The equipment was primitive but effective for blocking radio frequencies within a limited range. "How long would it take to set up jamming equipment that could disrupt their radio signals?" Colonel Martinez asked. 20 minutes if I can get to the shop," Miguel replied. "That's cutting it too close," Peterson said. "But I have an idea. Sarah, can you tell exactly which frequency they're using for the detonation signals?" Sarah listened carefully to the German radio chatter and identified the specific frequency being reserved for the synchronized explosion. Peterson disappeared into his barn and returned with an old amateur radio transmitter. "During the last war, I learned that sometimes the best defense against enemy radio communications is to flood their frequency with interference," Peterson explained as he quickly assembled the equipment. Sarah coordinated with her father and Peterson to create an improvised jamming operation. Using multiple radio transmitters, they began broadcasting static and random signals on the frequency that the saboteurs intended to use for their detonation command. Through her monitoring radio, Sarah heard immediate confusion in the German communications. "Command frequency is compromised, unable to establish clear signal for synchronized detonation." "Keep jamming," Colonel Martinez ordered. "We need to buy time for our people to reach those explosive positions." For the next hour, Sarah and her family conducted an electronic warfare operation from Peterson's farm. They rotated between different transmitters, constantly adjusting frequencies to stay ahead of the enemy's attempts to find a clear channel for their detonation signals. Meanwhile, teams of federal agents and local volunteers were approaching the sabotage sites. Sarah's real-time translation of enemy communications allowed the approaching teams to coordinate their movements and avoid ambushes. As the sun began to set, Sarah heard what she had been hoping for: panic in the German radio. "Communications. All teams report, unable to establish radio contact with command. Detonation frequencies completely jammed. Request new instructions." But there would be no new instructions. One by one, the enemy teams were being captured or neutralized by the UR coordinated response that Sarah's intelligence had made possible. The sophisticated sabotage operation that had taken months to plan was failing because of a teenager who had accidentally overheard their preparations while fixing her family's radio antenna. By evening, Colonel Martinez was able to report that all enemy operatives had been captured and all explosive devices had been safely disabled. Operation Desert Fox had been completely defeated, and the small Texas border town that was supposed to become an enemy base of operations remained secure. As Sarah finally allowed herself to rest, she reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had started with such a simple task. Her decision to repair the antenna had not only restored her family's radio reception, it had accidentally created the most effective counterintelligence operation of the war in the southwestern United States. 3 weeks after Operation Desert Fox was defeated, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting in a wood-paneled office in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of military officers and government officials who were still trying to understand how a 19-year-old girl had single-handedly prevented a major enemy sabotage operation. "Miss Martinez, your intelligence reports were more comprehensive and accurate than anything our professional analysts had produced about enemy activity in the southwestern border region," said General Harrison, the senior officer conducting the debriefing. "How did you manage to gather such detailed information?" Sarah looked down at the worn notebooks that had started this entire adventure. They were now classified government documents, filled with her careful handwriting and translations that had saved her town. "I just listened carefully and wrote down everything I could understand," she said simply. The government officials exchanged glances. They had interrogated the captured German saboteurs and confirmed that Sarah's translations had been remarkably accurate. More impressive still, her systematic organization of the intelligence had revealed patterns and connections that even trained analysts might have missed. The enemy operatives have confirmed that they were part of a larger network planning similar operations along the entire U.S.-Mexico border, General Harrison continued. Your discovery led us to uncover and prevent attacks on critical infrastructure in 3 other states. Sarah learned that the sabotage ring had been operating for over a year, establishing sleeper cells and conducting surveillance throughout the southwestern United States. They had chosen her hometown specifically because it appeared to be isolated and defenseless. Their plan had been to create a base of operations that could disrupt military supply lines and communications throughout the region. But they had not anticipated that their radio communications could be intercepted by a teenager with a recently repaired antenna and a solid understanding of German grammar. "Miss Martinez, we would like to offer you a position with the Army Signal Intelligence Service," General Harrison said. "Your natural aptitude for this work is extraordinary, and your country needs people with your skills." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her family and her small town. The past 3 weeks had been overwhelming, with government interviews, newspaper reporters, and military officials constantly asking questions about her discovery. "General, I appreciate the offer, but I think I'd like to go home and help my father with his radio repair business," Sarah finally replied. "Maybe I can use what I've learned to help train other people to listen for suspicious radio activity." The officials seemed surprised by her response, but General Harrison nodded with understanding. "Sometimes the most valuable people are those who remain connected to their communities," he said. When Sarah returned to Texas, she found that her hometown had become something of a local legend. The successful defense against the sabotage operation had made national news, and people throughout the region knew about the girl who had stopped enemy spies by fixing her radio antenna. But life gradually returned to normal. Sarah did indeed help her father expand his radio repair business, and they began offering classes to teach local residents about radio technology and communication security. The War Department provided funding for this training program, recognizing its potential value for homeland defense. Sarah's mother, Elena, became something of a celebrity herself, as word spread about how she had suggested jamming the enemy radio frequencies. Several women's organizations invited her to speak about the important role that civilian families played in national defense. Miguel Martinez found that his radio repair business had become the unofficial communications hub for the entire county. Military officials regularly consulted with him about radio security, and he became known as one of the most knowledgeable radio technicians in the southwestern United States. Old Henrik Peterson's farm became a designated observation post, officially recognized by the military as a strategic monitoring location for the border region. Peterson took great pride in his new role as a civilian defense coordinator. As for the antenna that had started everything, it remained on the Martinez family roof, still pulling in radio signals from across the continent. Sarah occasionally tuned in to listen to distant voices, but she never again intercepted enemy communications. The extensive counterintelligence operations that followed her discovery had effectively eliminated the sabotage networks throughout the region. Years later, when the war ended and the full story of wartime intelligence operations was declassified, historians would recognize Sarah Martinez as one of the most successful amateur intelligence operatives in American history. Her accidental discovery had prevented what could have been devastating attacks on American infrastructure and had led to the capture of an entire enemy spy network. But Sarah herself preferred to think of her story more simply. She had been trying to fix static on her family's radio so they could listen to President Roosevelt's speeches more clearly. Everything else that followed was just a matter of paying attention, taking careful notes, and having the courage to act when action was needed. The antenna still worked perfectly, providing clear reception for music, news, and all the normal radio programming that families expected to hear. Sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with the most ordinary intentions, and sometimes fixing a simple problem at home can end up protecting the entire country. By Friday morning, Sarah had filled 3 notebooks with her translations. She had barely slept, catching only fragments of conversation as the mysterious voices came and went throughout the night. The radio signals seemed to follow a pattern, strongest in the early morning and late evening with occasional bursts during the afternoon. Her father, Miguel Martinez, noticed her exhaustion immediately. "Mija, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as she stumbled into the kitchen for coffee. Sarah looked at her parents across the breakfast table. Her mother was frying eggs, humming softly to herself, unaware of the gravity of what Sarah had discovered. Her father was reading the local newspaper, occasionally shaking his head at news from the European front. They lived simple, honest lives, and Sarah wasn't sure how to explain that their home had become an accidental spy station. "Papa, I need to show you something," Sarah said quietly. She led him to the radio and demonstrated how she could tune into the German voices. Miguel's face went pale as he listened to the foreign conversation, even though he couldn't understand the words. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Since I fixed the antenna yesterday. I think the new connection is picking up some kind of transmission that we couldn't hear before." Sarah showed him her notebooks full of translations. "Papa, they're talking about our town. They mentioned the courthouse, the railroad bridge, and something about a shipment coming through on Sunday." Miguel studied his daughter's careful handwriting. Even though he couldn't read German, he could see that she had organized the information systematically: times, locations, code names, and what appeared to be operational details. His daughter had inherited his methodical nature, but applied it to something far more serious than radio repairs. "We need to tell Sheriff Thompson," Miguel said firmly. But when they arrived at the courthouse, they discovered that Sheriff Thompson was in the hospital with a heart attack. Deputy Carson, a young man barely older than Sarah, was handling all law enforcement duties for the county. When they explained their discovery, he looked skeptical. "You're telling me that fixing your radio antenna turned it into some kind of spy equipment?" Deputy Carson asked, barely concealing his disbelief. "And that you, a teenager, have been translating German spy communications?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn with frustration. "I know how it sounds, but you need to listen to the recordings. I wrote down everything I could understand." Deputy Carson glanced at her notebooks but didn't seem impressed. "Miss Martinez, there are a lot of radio signals bouncing around these days. Military communications, weather reports, amateur radio operators. Just because you hear German doesn't mean it's enemy activity." Miguel tried to intervene. "Deputy, my daughter's very smart. She graduated top of her class and she's been studying German for 3 years. Maybe you should at least investigate." "I'll make a note of it," Deputy Carson said dismissively, already turning his attention to other paperwork. "But right now I've got real problems to deal with. Mrs. Johnson's chickens got into the Hendersons' garden again, and there's been another break-in at the general store." Frustrated and worried, Sarah and her father left the courthouse. As they walked back toward their truck, Sarah noticed the same black government cars from the previous day still parked nearby. Men in suits were talking quietly near the vehicles, occasionally glancing around the town square with sharp, observant eyes. "Papa, what if those men are connected to the voices I've been hearing?" Sarah asked quietly. Miguel followed her gaze to the government cars. "Or what if they're here for the same reason we went to the sheriff? Maybe someone else has noticed strange activity." They drove home in thoughtful silence. Sarah spent the rest of Friday monitoring the radio, and the German voices returned stronger than ever as evening approached. This time, she heard something that made her stomach drop. The voices mentioned a specific time, Sunday at dawn, and discussed final preparations for something they called Operation Desert Fox. More disturbing still, they mentioned specific details about the town's layout that only someone who had been there recently could know. They talked about the water tower, the location of the gas station, and even mentioned old Mr. Peterson's farm, which sat on a hill overlooking the main highway. As Sarah frantically scribbled down translations, she realized that whoever these people were, they weren't operating from some distant location. They were close, possibly even within the town itself. The clarity of their radio signals and their detailed knowledge of local landmarks suggested they had been conducting surveillance for weeks or possibly months. That night, Sarah made a decision. If the local authorities wouldn't take her seriously, she would have to find someone who would. She had heard that the FBI had offices in larger cities, and El Paso was only a few hours' drive away, but first she needed more concrete evidence. Sarah spent Saturday gathering everything she could. She made clean copies of her translations, noting the times and radio frequencies for each transmission. She drew maps showing the locations mentioned, in the German conversations and tried to piece together what kind of operation they were planning. By Saturday evening, she had assembled a comprehensive file that painted a disturbing picture. The enemy communications suggested a coordinated operation involving multiple people, possibly targeting critical infrastructure in the border region. And according to the timetable she had decoded, whatever they were planning would begin in less than 24 hours. As darkness fell on Saturday night, Sarah sat by the radio one more time, hoping to intercept final details about Operation Desert Fox. What she heard instead made her realize that time had run out for careful investigation and proper procedures. The enemy was already in position and she might be the only person who could stop them.